Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Matbakh. This is our first episode in a brand new season. We're excited to kick things off with Nasser Jaber, who is the co-founder of the Migrant Kitchen, Komeeda, and the Refugee Food and Art Festival. He is calling us from New York. Nasser, welcome to Matbakh.
Thank you, Mikey. Thank you all for having me on afikra. I have to say that there was a lot of attention in the past 2 years, but I have never been more proud than to be here in a virtual room with you and the community of afikra, because what you guys have been doing for the past 8 years is more phenomenal than anything in terms of inclusion and showcasing Arab identity, and not just Arab, but also everybody from MENA. And it makes us more proud that we don't have to look to the West to be stimulated intellectually, but we can look within ourselves to do so. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Nasser. You're a part of that. So thanks so much for being a part of it.
Thanks. A little bit of an imposter syndrome. We can also a little bit talk about that during the call, because again, it's about curiosity over promotionalism. I think we started with a call of like, don't chase your dreams. Are we? So, okay. I don't want to curse, but one of my closest friends, he's a Tony-nominated writer of a big Broadway play, Moulin Rouge. And we were sitting down both alone and miserable on Valentine's Day eating Chinese food, fixing each other's dating profiles. And he was like, you know what, and screw chasing your dreams, really, because like we're not necessarily that happy. So like the idea of thinking of to do grand scale of things doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing, but like, being part of community, like afikra, being part of community in terms of impact, being part of community in terms of helping lift up people is probably worth more its weight in gold than I guess professional career goals and things like that.
Yeah. I think there's a question there about I don't think it's necessarily don't chase your dreams, but I think there's a question of question what your dreams are and why.
Exactly.
But let's go back a little bit. So somebody who's not familiar with your work at all, let's set the stage a little bit. You grew up you're originally from Ramallah. Let's talk about the 12-year-old Nasser and what he thought he might be doing and what his relationship to food was like and relationship to sort of restaurant culture was like.
I really wish that I have a story in which I can tell you that food was like somewhere growing up was part of my identity, and I really enjoyed eating and things like that. The truth of the matter of that is not the case. My mom is a horrible cook. I mean, I love her. God bless her. She's an awful cook, but she's an amazing tatriz artist. My dad was a good cook for certain dishes, not necessarily something like this innovative, like the ma'lube, Sultan Ibrahim, things like that. And 12-year-old Nasser has just came back. So my dad was, within the PLO apparatus, and we were, like Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Tunis, the whole circuit. And we were a family that was not corrupt. And as we could talk about that and those things later. But with that said, we didn't necessarily have a lot of money. So when we ended up going back home after the peace process, we ended up in our village of Turmusaya. Turmusaya is just like other Palestinian villages. It has a funny name because Turmusaya doesn't grow any turmus. So I have no idea why they called it Turmusaya. But they're mostly displaced in South America. And because of that, I was exposed to the Lebanese and Syrian presence in South America, because there is a Palestinian presence there, mostly in Chile, but also in Brazil and elsewhere. And in our daya, or in the village, they would have weddings and they will make like pastelitos, which is literally empanadas with kufta, or they would drink mate, which is like something that's big in Syria. And you don't necessarily connect these two in terms of gastro diplomacy. I didn't have the language or the lexicon to come in and say, like this is how it is, as I do today. But as a kid, like, oh, that was different than the next village next door who had something different. Things like that. Like Sanjil, for example, or Sinjil, for example, which is next to us, which is was a French colony at one point, and or Aboud, which is another town that eats. They consume escargot. They eat, but they do it like in a very Fallahi way, which is almost like ma'lube. It's a very strange way of eating escargot, but nonetheless. So 12-year-old Nasser was in Palestine, and 12-year-old Nasser was in a village that had a lot of money, but he himself was poor. And because I wanted to fit in, that means, buy the Tommy Hilfiger jeans and go to whatever the coolest burger joint that is available. Nasser couldn't afford to do that, and so Nasser started selling porn. I would get porn from the Israeli side for like 25 shekel, and because most of the village was expats that sent their wives and kids mainly because they probably don't want to be with them, like they probably want to be separated, but they couldn't divorce themselves because of community dynamics. So the idea was right? So they would send their wives and the kids there, and everybody's happy. They're not talking to each other. So the town was filled with 12 to 18-year-olds with flushed with cash. And all of them, of course, they abide by social dynamics of segregation. Unfortunately, it's not as open as it is in Lebanon. So all these kids, like they were buying porn from me. I was making around $1,000 a week selling this kind of stuff. Eventually, satellites came, and satellites kind of like put me out of business. That was like the first way of me realizing what the power of technology is. Because after
radio killed the Nasser star.
Exactly, right. But then, interesting enough, some kid got arrested stealing money to buy the porn, and therefore I got arrested, right? And of course, now this is the triggering part here, that not the triggering, but the moment of change that allowed me to I guess get where we are now, is that once the arrest happened, short of the like moral police kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
The entire village is there, and then automatically I got ostracized from the community. I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. I wasn't allowed in anyone's home. I was the bad kid, right? But because of that, I developed manic depression, which allowed me to get vitiligo. Now, vitiligo, nobody knew what it was. My skin was changing color because I was literally completely kind of like the scarlet letter, like it was complete disconnect from society for like 2 years, which is why I started getting into the internet and technology and coding and things like that. Anyway, it wasn't until the PCRF, Steve Sosby and his team showed up in when I was 17 that they told me this is vitiligo. So for a long time, because people didn't have the access to education, and we didn't have Wikipedia, and there was not many doctors, they thought it was leprosy. They thought it was buttocks, so nobody would touch you. So that allowed me, in a way, now as an adult, I realized allowed me to see others not for their physical appearance and not for their status, but for who they are really internally, because I was rejected for something that I couldn't control, which is my body rejected me, and there's an occupation, so society also rejects you, and then also there is the dynamics of me trying to be the porn king of Palestine. So there was that particular point. Now forward, I graduate from high school, and again, we don't have any money, so I land in New York 2 weeks before 9/11, and I find myself in the Bronx selling like phone clips, and I don't know if anybody here is in New York remembers Nextel phones. These are like phones that had like walkie-talkies in them. Anyway, it was an experience where I just literally had to become like a street peddler, anything that you would see of like the 100 years ago Arab immigration, because most of them were tujjar shanta, right? Like they were like people who were just like knocking on people's doors and selling stuff. But with that, I was able to learn Spanish because it was a South Bronx, and across from us there was a Zaro's bread basket. Zaro's bread basket. I would go there. There's a guy named Carlos from the Dominican Republic, and he would give me free hot dogs. We became friends in our loneliness, if you will. And he would invite me over to his house. His mom was an immigrant who didn't speak English. She was a maid. They lived in a Section 8 apartment. So for non-New Yorkers, Section 8 is like public housing. That's a little bit better than the projects because you have kids. And he told me that if you want to eat, because I was always hungry all the time, that you have to go work in restaurants, because restaurants will feed you. They give you a family meal. Now, at the same time, for different purposes and reasons beyond, I saw that you had the Eater article out. Carlos had a small sister at the time. She was like in the 5th grade, named Laseli. Laseli eventually grew up and became the head of the Migrant Kitchen and one of the head chefs that left and helped us feed the city around maybe 20 years later. So I ended up working in restaurants and off at Dallas Barbecue. So if you ever lived in New York and you went to Dallas Barbecue, it is not a restaurant. This is like McDonald's with seated service. It was actually an awful experience to work in. However, as I went to college to study finance, the more leftist I became, because I went to a very hardcore capitalist institution. I mean, like my classmate was Adam Newman, and that also plays a role later, the founder of WeWork, because we competed against each other in 2006 in the Merrill Lynch Entrepreneurship competition, where he did a baby clothing company And I did a guarana energy drink. I came second place, he came first place, and he went somewhere and I went somewhere else. Is that as the leftist I became, it wasn't necessarily because like I had some like provoking intellectual thought by reading Karl Marx, but like understanding, for example, that the Marxian theory of like alienation, in which like you, because of capitalism and because of the capitalist modes, you are yourself at home and not in society. So if you're a violinist and you can't be a violinist because you can't afford it, and you have to go like screw tires all day for 7 days a week, then that was one of the things that ended up. Sorry, I got a call. I had to reject it. Yeah. So anyway, long story short, I ended up learning a lot more from Dallas Barbecue, because I started seeing the dynamics of racism happening within the stores. The Mexicans were in the back cooking. The Bengalis were in the pack team. Like the whites would get a lot of preparation, and the blacks were like considered not people who tipped. There was a lot of stereotypes and racism, right? And then I'm seeing myself here as the Arab between both of them, seeing like, oh, if you think of an Arab person, you think Osama bin Laden, and like there was all these like racial jokes that would happen, right? Yeah. So that was like my experience with food early on, and I realized that food is very political, because the truth of the matter is, food at Dallas Barbecue is shit. It comes out from boxes. It's not a good experience, but it's the only place where folks from a certain economic, doesn't matter where their race is, but a certain economic class will come for a seated dinner, right? Yeah. Because you can, for $14, you can get like meat and protein and a drink. And that was, one access of seeing like how the owners of these restaurants would target impoverished neighborhoods to launch their businesses, which was in a way kind of like predatory. Yeah. Right. Sure. If you think about it from that sense. Anyway, I ended up getting fired because there was this Bengali cashier that I saw one day on the street with a veil. I'm not a religious person, I'm an atheist, but at work she doesn't wear a veil. And I was like, did you just start wearing the veil like today? And she goes like, no, I always wear it, but the manager told me I can't wear it. Who's also Bengali, by the way, because this is an American restaurant and I should take off my veil. And I thought that was kind of like racist and also sexist and misogynist, and she couldn't say anything. She doesn't know her rights. So the moment I spoke about that, I got terminated. And that just gives like, the industry changed later on, but at that time, around 2010, I stayed there for some time. That wasn't the case. Yeah. And people, it ran wild because you couldn't prove anything. Like everything from sexual harassment to racism, you couldn't prove it. There was this queer Mexican girl that was really, really nice. And they would call her tortilla, which, and that was like a derogatory term for what you would call queer women. And that was like, like these things are like really awful in the restaurant industry. So let me ask you a question. Ready? Go ahead. So at what point in this, so we've gotten to like 2010, right? At what point in this journey are you thinking to yourself, because you were clearly very entrepreneurial, even in college, right? You're entering entrepreneurship competitions. At what point are you thinking to yourself, I have ambitions about, there is a problem worth solving, and I have ambitions about solving that problem or trying to solve that problem through food or through the food business? At what point does all that stuff start to click? So that didn't happen until 2017. And the reason behind that is I was ashamed of working in restaurants, like for a long time. Maybe right now it's cool and hip and everybody's watching The Bear and Anthony Bourdain, may he rest in peace. But for a long time, you worked as a waiter. Like you're not moving up in society. And I would like to, I was ashamed of the fact that I wasn't able to secure a professional job like all my friends and things of the sort. So just to say I'm not a waiter, I'd be like, I'm an entrepreneur. But like, you have to be entrepreneuring something to like figure out what that is. So the first entrepreneurship job actually that I got was after I got a stint internship at Focus Features, the film company. I wanted to do a video on demand service in the Middle East. That was in 2011. I learned how to do that, eventually sold the background software to actually a Lebanese company that eventually went out. But nonetheless, like that was our first attempt to do. Like I learned how to do with code. Eventually joined Startup Weekend, did a second company. But it wasn't until like both these things technically failed or like semi like been okay, because it wasn't like really a lot of money, that I was still waiting tables, that I got the opportunity to open a restaurant in 2017, downtown Manhattan with two close friends of mine. One of them comes from the Zalatimo family. You probably would know that they're like, big baklava makers for 100 years. So like for him, it was important to open a restaurant, and we opened it together. Now the restaurant, of course, I never ran one. The idea is that, and here's the advice: if you're going to open a restaurant, open it with somebody else's money, because you're definitely going to fuck up, and then try to figure out from there. Which eventually, like what happened with me, right? And I'm grateful that the friendship stayed intact, even though it was a mess, because the restaurant, although it was good, was losing like $10,000 a month. It was awful.
This is Mazeish.
In Mazeish, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, Mazeish was downtown, and I thought Mazeish was going to be a hit because Mazeish, the location of Mazeish, used to belong to Eddie Wong. Eddie Wong, who is fresh off the boat and has a the famous chef. And before that, it used to belong to Palestinian, which was like a James Beard awarded tight spot. And I was like, oh yeah, like 2 great spots. I'm going to be number 3. But what they don't tell you is that they both failed there, but nobody's going to say that publicly in the press. They're going to be like, yeah, we're expanding. It's just that other factors happened that allowed them to scale, which also happened to me. So anyway, the restaurant wasn't doing necessarily so well. And at that time, I get a call. Actually, she's here, Layla, who is on the call, who is like a sister, a friend. I'm in debt to her for a lot of things. Layla helped. We talked about like doing a refugee dinner together, and through UNRWA, she was able to connect us with a Syrian refugee who was relocated to New York. And Syrians were not allowed in, but he was a queer Syrian. And of course, there's a lot of homophobia in the elderly communities because he didn't speak English, right? And unfortunately, in the Arab world, if you want to be gay and open, you're going to have to be from the rich society. Being from impoverished society, it means you're in hiding. And he didn't have any skills. I mean, he didn't even graduate high school. So the idea was to get him a job in the kitchen, but I couldn't afford to hire anybody. We were losing our shirt. I was living on my credit cards. My relationship was falling apart because the finances were too tough.
Yeah.
So I was complaining to my friend Justin, who I mentioned in the beginning of the call. He was doing the rehearsals for Moulin Rouge around the corner at the Clemente Theater.
Yeah.
And in his neurotic, very Jewish, anti-Zionist ways, he's like, Americans love happy endings. Now, Americans love happy endings. We need to do a dinner, and we need to write the story of the refugee as a point of overcoming. And we did. And he invites 2 people. One of them was Questlove. And there's the person from Eater, the blog that you just posted, and it blew up. Overnight, it became a movement. Everybody who wanted to resist Trump was coming in for this refugee dinners. And it was simple, right? Like you pay a ticket, the money, all of it goes to the refugee. They're cooking like Syrian food, which is, literally Lebanese or Palestinian or whatever else food, right? And they're just telling the story that I'm here to overcome. But what we realized was important is that the story of the refugee was more important than the ticket price, because the refugee would be like, I need an apartment to stay. And then a guest on the table would give an apartment for free to the refugee after they hear their story. Right? Wow. So like the ask was more important than the dinner. And eventually that scaled to go across the country. I mean, not only that it was like all over, like in the Times and Vogue, but we created manuals for people to do a how-to series and make sure that there's an ask. So we ended up lifting around like 700 to 1,000 people out of like to jobs and things like that. So it became a huge movement across the country, which we called Displaced kitchens. So it gets profiled in the Times and in Vogue, and I one day get a call from the State Department. And this is where like I'm saying sometimes you fall into things and not necessarily, like I didn't set out to the world to be like, oh, I want to save the world with food. Like, I had no idea.
Is this the same restaurant? This is the same...
This is now still in Mazeish, and this is really important in society when we talk about reality and then Instagram, right? Because on Instagram it looked like, oh my God, you're in Vogue with Beyonce, but like I'm losing my shirt, I can't pay my rent. Like reality versus social, right?
How do you not get cynical in those moments?
So here's the thing. There was a lot of lessons learned here. The first lesson is that when you come from a lot of insecurity, and when you come from a place with no confidence, and everybody's in a rat race to have a competition to be like the thing, right? You can become cynical, you can become bitter, you can become all these things. But then if you get a little bit of attention, it might get to your head. And it did get to my head, right? Because
it gets things worse.
Exactly, right? But like, again, the dichotomy between what's real and unreal. I mean, again, they're both real, right? I was Vogue in the New York Times, and I was like considered a national hero. But at the same time, I don't have a pot to piss in. So like, you have those two realities that exist, right? Okay. So that was a very humbling lesson, that don't get your ego too high, right? Because what eventually happened is that when the State Department called and said, we're going to take you to Turkey, and this is another factor that I learned, is that aid is awful. International aid is an occupation, right? This is what I learned along those routes. However, because it's going to happen anyway, if you are in the room with good intention and you're not a corrupt person, you can actually do good. But you have to understand that the factors are taken into consideration. One, the government that's giving the aid is only doing it for political purposes. The government that's receiving the aid also has political purposes. And they both have to subcontract to NGOs that have their own agenda. And the employees of that NGO are not necessarily making money. All they care about is their jobs and the reports that they have to send out. Because at the end of the day, an NGO is in the business of being NGO. So they have to consistently be NGOs, right? And along those lines, there's a lot of misspending that happens. And that's when there was a project in Turkey to launch like ghost kitchens for Syrian and Yemeni women that was completely mismanaged. And I was brought in for one thing, but ended up all of it. And again, like, you know, like I read a lot. I'm part of Startup Weekend. Like I read, I care a lot about like different things from psychology to business and whatever. So I was able to put all that into that project called the Life Project. And it scaled and it did so well that they took me to Sweden to do the same thing. And then they took me to Morocco to do the same thing. And that's what we called gastro diplomacy. So I was officially the gastro diplomat of the United States. I mean, I got a letter from the president saying, oh, thank you for doing this. I'm like, you're an asshole, because this was Trump, right? Like there was no need to do any of this stuff. I was like, this is weird. Because at the end of the day, you realize that the State Department, maybe the secretary will change, but the employees will always remain the employees no matter where the administration is. So like that's also super important. Anyway, so all of that happened. But to do that government project, again, there's also destiny in things, is that I had to become a government contractor, which means I had to be cleared, right? And there's a background check, there's all these things. And then that was it. Now, Mazeish failed, my relationship failed, and I ended up homeless. And of course, I was embarrassed to say I was homeless. And still, again, the dichotomy between what's real and not real, right? Like I'm flying out to Morocco cooking for 1,000 people, but I literally came back to New York without a place to stay. Like I had to stay at Thompson Square Park, and then it got cold, so I went to Horas, which is literally across the street, the Ergili spot. And then the waiter noticed I was there for 2 days, so he told Rami Rabaya, I don't know if he's on the line, it's a friend of mine. Anyways, they all helped me out, like basically to get a room. And then, Dan Dorado, who's my partner now, heard about what's happening. So he called me in, and he's like, listen, man, you got a lot of press. Let's figure out a way to like sell food just to get you back on your feet. And at that time I was completely like, I wasn't thinking about global health. I was just trying to think about how am I going to pay my rent, and send money to my parents. Exactly. And send money to my parents, because also at the same time, my dad was bedridden for like a number of years and he needs like help. And the only reason I ended up on the street is because even though I was working, I had to send the money back home, because medical care in Palestine is extremely expensive because we live under apartheid. So like, that's like another scenario.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when all that went down, I was like, okay, we'll call it the Migrant Kitchen. I honestly had no idea why I called it that name. I didn't even know it was a PBS show.
Hold on. I have a question though. Before this point, when does Komeeda start? So
I'm glad that you mentioned all of this. And I'm sorry that I skipped that part, for the sake of time. So Komeeda happened
just
when I was...
And to answer quickly, so like when did Komeeda start? Basically?
Yeah, so Komeeda was actually the Migrant Kitchen. Right, but it failed, right? Because after the restaurant failure, it didn't escalate a lot until I got into Komeeda. Komeeda started by a close friend of mine named Jaber, a great guy, and I didn't want to use a reservation system to book the refugee dinners. And this was one of those this one of those systems that strangers can come together and eat, which wasn't a case back then, but now it is. And we did it, and we scaled up. I had 20,000 users, and we launched at South by Southwest and held everything. But the P&L was awful. So again, reality versus like what's out there. We were like these hot founders that didn't afford, and we were like dumping money from our credit cards to make it work, which expedited the financial loss for me, because it was a restaurant and Komeeda. Yeah. So Komeeda, and if you notice, the Migrant Kitchen is the same colors as Komeeda. Like everything was the same, because when I went to Turkey, anyways, I ended up becoming a government contractor personally and at the company, because the paperwork wasn't sent in time. Yeah. So there was like all these all these issues. Yeah. Yeah. And Komeeda was like my first dipping toe into a company that actually is working, like to some capacity. There are user base, there's people doing it. I had to learn how to delegate, build teams, code, a lot of these things. Anyway, time I got to the Migrant Kitchen, as I mentioned, and I mentioned to Dan, we were not thinking that we're gonna, do anything special. To be honest with you, we were just trying to see if we can sell catering. So I have a friend of mine who's Iraqi and Swedish, is genius coder, and I was telling him that I'm tired of like going at 6 o'clock in the morning to Starbucks to sit down after like I find a couch to crash on, so I can pitch people on LinkedIn to buy catering. So he decided to build me a robot, which is like an AI software that plugs into Chrome. Exactly. So to scale up the LinkedIn pitching. So eventually I pitched so many people that it went to Adam Newman's assistant. She's like, well, you went to school with Adam. We recognize your work. That's when they were going through the financial crisis and they needed somebody to come sell vegan food at WeWork. So I went, and my first customer was Sean King, the civil rights activist. So he takes a picture. All of a sudden, we're in 25 stores. But at that time, it's not like I had a facility or restaurants. I just was renting the back of a bar with Dan Dorado, working there from like 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. and then going to work at a Palestinian restaurant called Qanun from 4 p.m. to close. Like it was just a shitty life, right? Across the board, listening to like really awful music on the way in. It was like depressing, So anyway, so as this was happening, COVID hits. Now, this is also important on where you meet, right?
Yeah.
I have a mentor who's Swedish named Sebastian, and Sebastian at that time when I was on the street, I reached out to everyone to talk to them. I was ashamed to tell everybody I was homeless, but I was unemployed. I was not having a good time. I looked frail, So I went to see one of my mentors, and he was sitting on a couch. Next to him was Ayman Muhyiddin, the anchor from MSNBC. And now I'm like, oh crap, you're Ayman. And he was like, yeah. And it was actually Tariq Shara too, his friend, the actor. Who's a great guy. His family are amazing, and we became close friends too. And I followed Ayman on Insta 6 months as I was building into Migrant Kitchen, and that also plays a role later, right? So now come COVID, I have 25 WeWork location. I have 1,000 plates in my fridge.
Hold on, Nasser, I have a question for you. At this point, right? You're like, what I feel like is there's a common thread through the story, which is like, things get good. Well, things get good, but somehow the sort of like undercurrent fundamentals of the business don't seem to allow you to like break even.
Exactly.
Is this true? Like, it's no matter how much water is going through the pipes, it's almost like the fundamentals of the business don't allow revenue to turn into profits.
That's correct, and that's simply because many things we can talk about them as we talk about the foundation of the company, the Migrant Kitchen now, because all those failures led to a successful operation now within 9 months, right? Because I learned from Komeeda, for example, that revenue is over expenses. I learned how to delegate correctly. I learned that press will get to your head, so give the press to your team, don't give it to yourself. Otherwise, ego will be a problem. A lot of these things. Impact is important, but you know what? Also, you need to have a scalable business and a profitable business. How do you do it correctly? So with WeWork, we were doing okay. We were doing okay just to the point where I was able to get a room, pay my rent, send my parents some money, start paying off my debt, right? And that was like so it was, and Dan is a genius executioner. I mean, he's a 2-star chef. He knows good food and he knows systems like a military guy, where I come in and I do vision, do like the sales, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, so as this was happening, COVID hit. And at the time I was in love, or not in love, but like, I really liked this Lebanese doctor at one of the hospitals. And she called and she said, I have no food. Of course, I want to be the romantic hero. I'm like, well, I have a lot of food on March 16th, right? And she's like, I need 20 plates.
You know the date. You know the date even.
I mean, because it was the night COVID happened, right? It was the city that shut down, right? And there was no restaurants and they were slammed in the ER. So I was like, listen, I actually have more than 20 plates. I can give you like 200. She was like, really? And I'm like, yeah. So I dropped 200 plates at the ER. And then I went and dropped another 300 plates at Mount Sinai through another friend because they contacted each other. And then Ayman sees that on Instagram and he's like, can you come on the show? I go on Ayman's show, but then I tell Justin, the same guy, and he's like, I'm going to create a GoFundMe for you with an $18 like good luck, thing in it, whatever. And we raise $100,000. And all of a sudden now we're feeding the healthcare workers. And that becomes, again, just like the refugee dinner series, a national or an international call to action. So Andreas sees that. And Jose Andres goes like, I want the healthcare workers, because that's now the play. Of course, I didn't know at the time, Jose has a FEMA, has money coming in from FEMA. He's a subcontractor. He basically took what disaster relief work is and just made it cool and hip and executionable, right? So he's like, I'm gonna pay you for those meals, those healthcare where you just put World Central Kitchen stickers on it. And I was like, fine, but there's a lot of undocumented folks in Jackson Heights. There's also the Palestinian community in Patterson. You also have to give me meals for them. He's like, okay, this is a handshake agreement. I'm only going to pay for the doctors, but I will give you the cash. And Jose stuck to his word, at least for that particular moment. So he paid me for the meals, and now all the meals that were going out to the hospitals from my kitchen, they were going out now with World Central Kitchen stickers. He takes 1,000 meals from my fridge or from my kitchen, which I rented at the time. I rented it because everything shut down. People were donating produce, and we were on the news. Eventually, people started contacting us like crazy. And he went on TV and said, he's announcing that he's feeding all the healthcare workers, which is what he did. And eventually he was nominated for a Nobel, right? So with that, I realized how World Central Kitchen operates, right? They subcontract, but they're government contractors. So really, it's just a simple way of subcontracting and just bidding on things, basically, and just doing it cool and doing it with honesty and all that stuff, right? So, and that's why I love Nate Mook, the CEO. He's now the former CEO. He's just exited after feeding almost 3 million meals in Ukraine, but they're a great organization in that sense. So they taught us a few things. Anyway, the Washington Post on May 7th does a big piece saying the Migrant Kitchen should be a disaster relief company that we should look for. And at that time, I guess de Blasio, the mayor, was not having a good relationship with Cuomo, the governor. And Cuomo likes, I guess, World Central Kitchen. So de Blasio calls us noon after the article comes out and awards us $10 million to feed New York. Right?
Wow.
And then at 2 p.m., my dad dies of COVID in Palestine. So now to feed 3.5 million meals, which was with the contract, and you can't be in violation of it, I had to go to and this is where the entrepreneurship thing comes in, is that I had to go to the Irish bars, because the Irish bars are only owned by a few Irish families. And in the United States, the Australians and the Irish don't need a visa to come work, right? Like they just can come in. They have this long established rules that if you're Irish or Australian, you can just hop in, work legally, no problem. So a lot of these Irish bars hire a lot of these Irish workers that work on tips, and they make thousands of dollars and they hop off in the summer. Like it's totally fine, right? They can open a bank account, all that stuff. But that means that they can't get PPP, which is the payment protection that they handed out to businesses to save them. So overnight, these guys were like almost defunded. So I was able to take on all their kitchens, and on Stone Street, which is a huge downtown street in Manhattan where all the Irish bars are, I started doing all those meals in refrigerated trucks, and I had to use the refrigerated trucks basically to store meals, because we have to cook a day in advance for things, right? And using all those bars. So then when my dad passed, I had to go along with my best friend Chris Catania and bury him on Zoom in a refrigerated truck, then literally take the trucks, lead them to the National Guard where we were delivering meals to the public now, because it's no longer just the healthcare workers. And that was again, we talk about the imposter syndrome and the bipolarity of things. Like overnight, life fucking changed in ways that you cannot imagine. So who are you at this point, right? Yeah. But I'm also keeping in check that ego, this and that, right? At the same time, and this is now around May, that Lebanon was going through the worst banking crisis ever, right? And for me, I love the Lebanese. I worked at Ilili for some time as a waiter. And I do have to tell you, my love for the Lebanese came from the younger generation, the elderly generation, at least the generation that went to Ilili was a generation that was kind to other people, but to me as a Palestinian was not. And that's because of the reminiscences of the Civil War. And I completely understand that. But because I felt so much guilt about this remarks that I had for over a couple of years, I was like, you know what? I'm going to go in and try to feed Beirut. Maybe this is a self-healing for me, because I learned how to do it from World Central Kitchen. It's literally a subcontracting thing, right? And at the same time, I just care about these things and see how it goes. So I contracted with an amazing Lebanese company. You guys should check them out, called Trick or Treat. They make vegan snacks for kids and things of the sort. They have a kitchen, and they're lovely couple. And I contracted their kitchen, and I worked with a friend of mine named Dalia Tarabi. She's an amazing Lebanese expat, Harvard, all that stuff. She started a kitchen in in her family's home in the Jebel. She's Druze, and we call it Matbakh al-Sha'b or whatever. And we started handing out meals, and it was fine. Like, you know, these things were happening up until August 4th, and that's when international attention came to Beirut, and that of course meant that Jose and I again team up in Beirut.
Wait, hold on. So Nasser, you started doing the collaboration in Beirut in the summer of
2020.
2020, and during COVID plus financial crisis, you're like, hey, things in Beirut are tough. I'm going to try to feed the people whose salaries are slashed by 95%.
Exactly.
And you see that you're doing it for like 6-7 months or 12 months
with our own cash, no financial assistance up until well, actually with our financial, only with our money from May to August. But then when the port explosion happens, donations came in. So I can't say that like it's just Migrant Kitchen cash, but like there was definitely public assistance from that front. A lot of families came in to support. And this may be a little bit tough to hear, but I have to tell you that I had to put a lot of the cash on blockchain, because certain families that wanted to donate money, that trusted me personally to do it, only wanted to feed certain areas. And that's when my first interaction with the Lebanese secretarial like divide, like as an outsider. And it's not something that and this is not something that like I do believe the younger generation doesn't have, but the generation with money, or like the elderly with money, have it, and you know they have their own reasons, and you know it's not my place to comment on it. But anyway, so I ended up feeding everyone. I mean, that was the whole point. Eventually, we ended up feeding the entire thing, and we had to coordinate with the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, because dish that goes to a certain place might end up coming back as like, oh, you're funding terror, right? I mean, like, so like we had to really make sure that everything is all agreed upon and compacted and things of the sort. And then I went to Beirut for the first time. I've never been, and you know, I went at a time where everything was closed. There was nothing about the Beirut lifestyle that I always hear about. There was no Sky Bar or any of those stuff. You know, like there was just. I mean, I wasn't going there anyway, but in general, like, you know, when people talk about Beirut, they talk about life, like the love for life. And there wasn't any of that at that time. And there was barely any traffic because everybody was home. So, you know, I ended up exploring the city as it was closed, and seeing what's happening at the port and things of the sort. We ended up going to a winery called Dar al-Hamra. So everybody in Lebanon should go there. They're great people. They hire refugee women to make wine, and we just bought a bunch of their wines and basically try to support them to stay afloat. They're in Nabah, so they're great people. Anyway, started doing that. I started feeding the refugee camps as well, and that was a big, you know, moment for me where like I was like, you know what, this is exactly the work that I would like to be doing, right? And I come back to New York, and now it's time to like figure out how are we going to scale this company or like end it, right? And then
the company at this point is called the Migrant Kitchen. Do you have a brick and mortar store yet?
We have nothing. Like we have nothing. We don't have facilities. We don't have anything. But we just have an idea that we're able to execute simply because we were flush with enough cash to like basically subcontract out in other facilities.
But there is a registered company called the Migrant Kitchen at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, they're like legally on paper, like it's an LLC, it has a website, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So me and Dan sat down and said, okay, look, we could either exit right now, be okay for the rest of our lives, or you know, you can do whatever you want. You no longer have to be on the street, or we could double down. And this is again probably one of the foundations that you're talking about in terms of risk taking. And we were like literally in the back of an awful bar that hasn't had the bathroom cleaned in like 10 years. And as the city was starting to reopen, this is now like November of 2020, and we were like, okay, all in. You know what I mean? Like let's just go. It's almost like putting yourself down on the roulette table, and let's go build this brand. Right? It's gonna be a facility that's in Queens, that's like 7,000 square feet, that is effectively an FDA or a USDA operated. That means I can do packing and cooking on large scale. I'm happy to give you guys a tour where I'm actually in the facility today. And then we will do a bespoke model of retail operations that doesn't require big build outs. But then I told Dan, I was like, okay, but if we're going to build this company, it has to have the values that we believe in. You're Mexican, I'm Palestinian. We need to pay wages that are like high. So we were the first ones to pay $25 an hour. That Zagat did a big piece on it. We changed the industry in that sense. Because like nobody lives on a wage of $15 in New York. That's awful and disgusting and offensive. Two, we will hire migrants and figure out a way to get them into citizenship by working with legal, like neutralization agencies and things of the sort, people that protect sanctuary cities. The third is that I would like to take these folks who come from like impoverished South American nations mostly and train them to become entrepreneurial thinking. So how do we teach them the Toyota model, right? For example, the Toyota, has the most lean production model and things of the sort. Anyway,
so you're basically saying, okay, I want to take social justice, the things I care about, social justice, combine them with the things I care about, the things I've seen that works in terms of like food. And I've noticed this idea of culinary diplomacy, those things I care about. And then I'm going to mix it with Startup Weekend.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we did all of that. And then we tested the menu in a pop-up because we always now test things like A/B testing. And it got an eater review. Ryan Sutton wrote basically a 2-star write-up. They took the stars away for COVID so they don't hurt restaurants. But like when Ryan Sutton gives you a review that's good, it's like it's a star review, right? And all of a sudden we realized that we have something. And then the New York Times wrote about it, and then it became a national sensation in terms of how everybody's talking about it. It got rated best restaurant, top 10. And then we started opening models. But I also wanted to empower my community in terms of how we build this business.
This is a crazy story, Nasser.
Yeah, it gets more than that. But I guess the point is that now, the final thing I'm going to say is that we hired Riyad Jakka to do this. He's Lebanese and Palestinian. He is an amazing so he designed all our stores. Tahir Abu Qara, who used to lead engineering for Equinox around the globe, built our kitchen, and it was impact of our community. So our cooks were Latino, our engineers, accountants, and financiers were Lebanese and Palestinian, Syrian, Arab, and Egyptians, and all that stuff. And it was a community effort to scale up. And I hope that the Migrant Kitchen ends up becoming a global chain. Yeah. And we have the Migrant Kitchen Foundation, which is the Migrant Kitchen Initiative, which is our 503c, which operates like World Central Kitchen. And I really hope that I'm able in the next 3 to 4 years to open disaster relief kitchens in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Palestine to at least feed the school kids, like the No Kid Goes Hungry project. That is my dream. And
amazing.
And this is where we are. And I guess go ahead. Yeah.
No, I want to get to the Pastelon Mahshi. Okay, so we asked you to pick one dish. Every Matbakh episode is one dish. Tell us about this dish and why you chose it.
So I told you, like, my mom's cooking is awful, right? Again, Allah yahmiha, right? But nonetheless, like, she only likes to make mahshi. And I hate mahshi. I hate mahshi so much because, like, she would, like, make me, like, work it with her. And, like, it wasn't that good. Like, I'm probably the only Arab that hates kusa wara. Like, I get it. I'm sorry. I know it's offensive to people to say that to them. But because I hate kusa wara so much, I was like, okay, I was telling the team on how much I don't like it, that Chef Naselli decided, was like, we actually have a stuffed plantain in the Dominican Republic. And I don't know and this is something that I forgot to mention, but when I met Carlos when I was like, 17, a long time ago, he had kibbeh in his house, and he was like, oh, this is kibbeh, this is Dominican cuisine. I'm like, no, my man, this is like the Lebanese brought it to you guys. And like, we're seeing that like back and forth, right? Where like pastor comes from the Lebanese. So we decided to make the stuffing of the kusa wara without the rice into this pastelon, into the plantain, topped with like tahina and cheese and things like that. And we called it our plantain mahshi. And we didn't think this dish would do well, but then Ryan Sutton called it the best dish in New York in another article. And here's also something I learned. So even though this dish was amazing, this is not a dish you eat every day. I mean, like, you'll eat it and like not move for like 6 weeks. So therefore, I realized that what the critics like, the public will not buy. So if you look at our first iteration of our menu, we had sakhan fried chicken over a falafel waffle. We have the plantain mahshi. I mean, like, even Pete Wells, the biggest critic in the country, said to us, is like, this menu looks like quirky kitchen pranks, but they're executed like with like amazing skills. Yeah. And we realized that you can't eat that every day. So how do you become an everyday location? Like, how do you go to the Migrant Kitchen every day? And this is when we took on looked at the competition, like Dig In and other places where people eat every day, the healthy kind of stuff, and wanted to implement this kind of innovation into the menu. But this is still one of my favorite dishes, even though currently it's not on the menu.
Very cool. So next time I'm in New York, we got to set this up.
100%.
Okay, let's do the quick Q&A then. We have a question in the chat. Okay, the quick Q&A. So what are you reading or watching right now? I feel like you are, for information, what's going into your brain right these days?
So I'm currently finishing up The Machine That Works, which is a second book about the Toyota production. But I'm also reading The Art of Memoir because I have a memoir coming next year, and I have to figure out at least, even though there's a ghostwriter, I mean, full disclosure, I'm not going to sit, I don't have the time to write this book, but I still have to figure out a way to put the things to the writer, right? To put into place. So I'm reading those two books. And cool. I picked up a book بالعربي because I love to read بالعربي, and it's called تذكرة المساعد القطار, which is a novel that I actually bought in Beirut cool. from an Egyptian novel. Yep.
Very cool. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Okay, so of course I would say Anthony Bourdain, right? But that's a classic answer. May he rest in peace, whatever. But there was also Ray Dalio, and that happened 3 months ago.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, I got an hour mentorship with him, and he's the one who helped me basically sit down, and we talked about the foundation of the business.
The principles.
The business, exactly. So in a reality, at the end of the day, even though we were a counterculture movement,
it makes sense of the business.
We operate as a hedge fund internally, with everything hedging against each other. So, and a lean production process in the kitchen, which I'm happy to show you if we have the time.
Yeah. What is your guilty pleasure midnight food choice?
So if you're in New York and you've ever were in impoverished areas, there's fried chicken joints that are all owned by Afghans, either called Crown Fried Chicken or Texas Fried Chicken, and it's mostly cheap halal meat. And I love to have that fried chicken. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I also like to eat chicken and rice from the streets because I don't have a high-end palate. People are like, oh, would you like this fried oysters with caviar? I'm like, no, chicken and rice from 53rd and 6th. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's
with the white and red sauce.
Yeah, exactly. Where you will go to the bathroom for 6 weeks.
Well, it's a good 6 weeks. Okay. Yeah. What dish reminds you most of home?
I really love matlube. I know this is a very classic thing to say, but the only reason I love it is that because that was the only dish my dad perfected, and I liked it. But my favorite dish is the one that reminds me most of home. My favorite dish is a mlukhiyya. I can eat that all day. It will be my last dish on earth. If I had it, I said that once, I think, in a podcast. But cool. So matlube reminds me of home. Mlukhiyya is what I would like.
Okay, so we have one question on right now, and it is curious if you were inspired by Sarah Khan's Migrant Kitchen in Queens.
I actually have no idea. I think I follow her on social, and she recently got married. I'm not sure if that's the person we're talking about because I noticed that this morning. Okay. But I was not. I have no idea if that. I was actually not inspired by anybody for the Migrant Kitchen. I just needed a name for a company. I had no idea it would work. But I am inspired by a lot of people, though.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to take you up on that little tour because we've never done that before, and I think it would be a lot of fun if you're willing to. That'd be awesome. Let's do it. So, and while Nasser takes us on a tour, I'm going to type the feedback link into the chat. Amazing. Yeah. So walk us through this. What are we going to look at?
I'm turning the camera on. For some reason, it's not turning. Is there?
No, I can see it. No. I can see the. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, you can see the facility. So this is the corporate office, but the facility is here. As you can see, this is our entire team, and they're all in blue today because we have donations that go out. But everything gets cooked out of these facilities here, and I'll take you downstairs to show you. And then gets sent out to the restaurants. We have another facility like that, like I mentioned, in Turkey, and another one in Morocco. But
how many restaurants are there?
Sorry?
How many restaurants does it get sent out to?
We have 4, and we're going to open 2 more in the next few months. So all the food goes into these big walk-ins. I will lose connection if I walk in. So this is one of them, for example. But so also, Le Pain Quotidien went out of business, and we were able to buy all their stuff on liquidation. So, for example, one of the reasons that we are able to cook everything ahead of time and send it out to the stores is because we have these blast chillers that like save like the flavor of the food because they freeze everything within 5 minutes.
Wow.
Right. And then everything is cooked here. Everybody works as a team. And what's beautiful about this is that everybody here on this line is able to stop production at any moment if they see something wrong, which is that lean model that we talked about. Like, so for a store, and everything is automated, by the way. So this is our favorite sous chef, Julie. Hi, Julie. Right? Everything is automated through technology. So what ends up happening here is that the stores are connected to these similar systems. So if they order, like, let's say 10 chickens and they sell 10 chickens, the system, as soon as they hit 2, will reorder from the commissary kitchen. So inventory is automated throughout the process. And we can like catch like everything in terms of like sales and margins and things of the sort. And sometimes we play soccer games here. And yeah, so this is what we do.
Amazing. Okay. Nasser, thank you so much. Jeez, this was so much fun. For anybody watching, you can follow Nasser and Migrant Kitchen online. Just very easy to find them. And check out the website. If you're in New York, go grab a bite. Let us know how you like it. And as always, let your friends know about the podcast. Send this episode, which will go out tomorrow on YouTube and on our podcast, which you can find everywhere and on social media. So if anyone missed it that you know would love it, you can send it to them. Nasser, thanks so much for being a part of this. I really appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you too.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Yalla, bye.